Nobody in that end of Merced County could explain why the new kid was hauling old beehive boxes out of a dumpster behind a bee supply store on the edge of town. Milo Andrick was 16, and his family had been in California for less than a year. Moved out from Ohio when his father took a foreman job on a leased almond block. And in a farming community where some families had worked the same ground for 4 generations. A transplant kid with an Ohio accent had exactly no standing to explain himself to anyone. He had not made a single close friend at the new school. He did not know the names half the older men on that road went by. He asked the owner of the bee supply store anyway if he could take the damaged equipment out back. The cracked boxes and rotted frames the store could not sell, and the owner, who was closing out a struggling side of the business, told him to take all of it and good riddance. Milo hauled 18 old hive boxes home in the bed of his father's truck across 4 trips, and then he spent a month doing something that made even less sense than collecting them in the first place. He cleaned them, repaired what he could, and then he started hanging them, empty, in trees along the edge of the property and the dry creek bottom behind it. 10 feet up, 15 feet up, facing a particular direction he had worked out from a library book, baited with nothing anyone could see. The almond growers on that road had opinions about a lot of things, and they had an opinion about this. The kid was playing beekeeper with garbage, hanging empty boxes in trees like a boy building forts. And in a valley where real commercial beekeeping meant semi-trucks hauling in millions of dollars of rented colonies every February, an empty box nailed to a cottonwood limb was not going to be mistaken for anything serious. 10 months later, in the worst pollination shortage that valley had seen in a generation, when trucked-in commercial hives were scarce and growers were bidding against each other for whatever colonies they could get, there was one small orchard block that had bees when almost nobody else could find any. And every one of those bees had come out of a dumpster and a boy. Nobody had taken seriously. If stories about outsiders, old knowledge, and the wisdom that gets overlooked mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. We would love to know how far this story has traveled. The Central Valley of California grows a very large share of the almonds eaten anywhere in the world, and the entire crop depends, every single year, on an operation of staggering scale that most people who eat almonds never think about at all. Almond trees cannot pollinate themselves reliably. Every February, when the bloom opens across hundreds of thousands of acres all at once, roughly 2 hives of honeybees are needed for every acre to move enough pollen between trees to set a full crop. Almost none of that pollination happens with bees that live in the valley year-round. It happens with rented colonies, more than 2 million hives, trucked in on flatbeds from as far away as the East Coast and the Dakotas. A single enormous seasonal migration of insects that exists for exactly one purpose and lasts exactly a few weeks before the trucks load up again and move on to whatever comes next on the calendar. That system is fragile in a way most growers try not to think about too hard. Commercial beekeeping across the country has been losing colonies at a rate that would have ended most other industries decades ago. Winter losses running well above what any healthy population could sustain on its own, driven by mites, pesticide exposure, disease, and the sheer stress of trucking colonies across the country for a living. Hive after hive stacked on a flatbed for days at a stretch. When a bad winter hits the commercial beekeeping industry, it hits almond growers in California the following February, in the form of scarce hives and rental prices that climb by the week as bloom approaches. Milo did not know any of that when he started hauling boxes. What he knew came from somebody else entirely. Her name was Selam Bekele, and she lived 2 properties down the dry creek from the Andricks, an Ethiopian woman in her 70s, who had come to that valley decades earlier and who kept, in her side yard, a collection of hollowed and hand-built log hives that the whole road considered one more piece of harmless old country eccentricity. Nobody local kept bees the way Selam Bekele kept bees. She did not buy colonies. She had never bought a colony in her life. Every hive in her yard had arrived on its own, drawn in from the wild by boxes she had prepared and hung and waited on, a method she had learned from her own father in the highlands, where beekeeping had been practiced that way for longer than anyone in that country could put a date on, passed down through hands the same way the log hives themselves were passed down, worn smooth from generations of use before they ever crossed an ocean in her memory. Milo met her by accident, chasing a loose dog of his father's onto her property, and he stayed because he had never seen anything like what she showed him that afternoon. An occupied hollow log 12 feet up in a fig tree that she had put there empty 18 months earlier and simply left, and that a wild swarm had since claimed entirely on its own, without a single dollar changing hands anywhere in the process. Here is what Salam Bekele explained to him over the following weeks, and it is the whole mechanism behind everything Milo eventually built. A wild honeybee colony, when it grows too large for its cavity, splits. Roughly half the bees leave with the old queen in a swarm, and that swarm does not simply settle anywhere. Scout bees fan out first and inspect dozens of potential homes over a radius of several miles, and they are extremely particular about what qualifies. Research on the subject going back decades has shown that bees consistently prefer a cavity of a specific size, close to 10 gallons in volume, with a small entrance no larger than a couple of square inches, set well off the ground, ideally with some trace scent of a previous colony still inside it. Old dark comb, beeswax, propolis, the residue of bees that lived there before. Scouts report back to the swarm through a kind of vote, dancing out the location and quality of what they have found, and the swarm as a whole moves once enough scouts agree on the same site. A bait hive, built and placed correctly, checks every one of those boxes on purpose. The right internal volume, a restricted entrance the bees find defensible, height above the ground, away from easy predators, and most importantly, scent, which Salam achieved the old way her father had taught her, rubbing the inside of every box with melted beeswax and a handful of dried lemongrass, whose oil closely mimics the pheromone bees themselves release, to mark a location as safe and already claimed. A scouting bee investigating a bait hive prepared that way finds every signal it has evolved to trust, and it reports back to the swarm accordingly, with no way to know the box was empty a week before. None of it costs anything but time and patience. No bees have to be purchased. No truck has to arrive from out of state. The valley, like most of agricultural California, still carries a substantial population of wild and feral honeybee colonies living in hollow trees and wall cavities and abandoned structures, swarming every spring the same as they always have, looking for exactly the kind of home a properly prepared box provides, whether or not anyone is out there offering one. Milo built 18 bait hives that first spring out of the salvaged boxes, cleaned and scented the way Salam taught him, hung at the height and orientation she specified along the creek bottom and the edge of the almond block. 11 of them caught swarms before summer was out. That was the discovery. What came after was building an actual apiary out of 11 wild colonies, with no experience managing bees at all, which very nearly did him in more than once. He was stung badly enough in June that his eyes swelled shut for 2 days, and his father drove him to an urgent care clinic against his protests. He lost one full colony to absconding when he disturbed a hive too early, checking it before the bees had properly settled, and watched the whole cluster lift off the following morning and vanish back into the wild the way they had come. He learned, mostly by getting it wrong first, how to transfer a colony out of a bait box and into a proper managed hive without destroying the comb they had already built, work Salam walked him through slowly, correcting his hands more than his thinking, because in her telling the bees would forgive almost any mistake except an impatient one. His mother was the one person in the family who never came around to any of it. She had grown up with a cousin who had gone into anaphylactic shock from a single sting on a summer afternoon, and nearly died in a hospital 40 minutes from the nearest town, and every one of Milo's swollen fingers, and every hive box stacked closer to the house than she liked, reopened that fear fresh, a fear that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with a memory she had carried her whole life. She did not forbid it outright. She made him keep an epinephrine injector in his backpack at all times, made him promise never to work a hive alone, and told him plainly more than once, sitting across the kitchen table from him late at night, that she would rather have a son with no bees at all than one who ended up on the ground in a field with nobody close enough to help him. By the following winter, Milo had 9 established colonies, strong enough by his own inexperienced judgment to consider renting them out for the coming almond bloom, the way the big commercial outfits did. A neighboring grower named Presley Coates, a man who ran 40 acres and had watched the whole project unfold from his own fence line with open skepticism, agreed. mostly as a favor and mostly because that year the going rental rate for commercial hives had already climbed past anything he wanted to pay, to let Milo place 4 colonies in his orchard for the February bloom at a fraction of the commercial price. 3 weeks before that bloom, the failure came, and it came after the part of the story that was supposed to be the success. A neighboring field, not Coates' land but a row crop operation 2 properties over, sprayed an insecticide during a warm afternoon when Milo's bees were flying hard, chasing whatever bloom they could find in the winter cover crop between the almond rows. It was legal application, done within label guidelines, and it still killed bees by the thousand. 3 of his 9 colonies collapsed within days, workers dying in drifts in front of the hive entrances, the colonies too weakened to recover before bloom. A 4th was hit hard enough by a mite outbreak that had been building quietly all winter that it was not fit to send out either. Milo went from 9 colonies to 5 in the space of 10 days, with the Coates contract due and no way to explain to a skeptical grower that half his bees were simply gone. Salam helped him do the only thing that could be done in the time left, combining the surviving weaker colonies with the strongest ones, uniting queens and workers carefully, so the merged hives came out strong instead of merely doubled and still fragile. Treating what remained for mites as aggressively as the calendar allowed, it produced 5 colonies instead of 9, but 5 colonies that were, by the time bloom opened, genuinely strong. Presley Coates did not believe 5 scavenged half-wild colonies built by a teenager were going to do the job 4 commercial colonies would have done. And he said so plainly, and he told Milo he would be watching the fruit set on that block closely, because if it came in light he was not paying full price for the difference. Milo had no way to argue him out of that doubt in advance. The only answer available to him was to let the bees work and then count. Bloom came in the 3rd week of February, and Milo's 5 hives worked that orchard hard, flying in weather several of the trucked-in commercial colonies on neighboring blocks, stressed from the drive and slower to build back up after weeks on a flatbed, mostly sat out. When the petals dropped and the nutlets began to set, Coates walked his own rows counting, the way growers do every year to estimate the coming crop, comparing the block Milo had worked against a block of his own, worked by a commercial rental outfit at full price, tallying nutlets on the same number of limbs on each side, so the comparison would be fair. The block with Milo's bees came in with a fruit set at least as strong as the commercial block, and by a careful count along 2 rows, slightly better. Presley Coates paid him in full, and told him afterward, standing at the edge of the orchard, that fairly caught bees that had survived on their own with no chemical treatment and no coddling before Milo ever found them, were tougher stock than anything trucked in on a flatbed, and that he supposed the boy had known something the rest of the valley had stopped bothering to ask about. It should have changed something in that valley. It mostly did not. Coates renewed with Milo the following year, and word of what had happened spread as far as the feed store, and a handful of people asked polite questions over coffee before going back to their own operations. But the almond industry runs on a system built over decades, insured, contracted, familiar, and one teenager with 11 feral colonies pieced together out of a dumpster was never going to be mistaken for an alternative to it by anyone running more than a few dozen acres. The growers who could still afford commercial rentals kept ordering them, the way they always had, because a familiar system that mostly works is a hard thing to walk away from even after it fails you once. The system that nearly failed that year rebuilt itself the way large systems usually do, absorbing one bad season and moving on largely unchanged. Milo kept his hives anyway. He grew the apiary slowly over the following years, working with Salam until she was too old to climb a ladder herself, and he never stopped setting bait boxes along that creek bottom every spring. The same scent, the same height, the same patient waiting that had never needed a single dollar spent on a truck. Salam Bekele. That is the name Milo says, still, when anyone new asks him how he got started, before he explains anything else at all. Have you ever proven something true and watched the world go right on doing things the old way anyway? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from tonight.